Wheel of Genre, the show for readers who miss the days when sci-fi was a cheap drugstore gamble. Each month we spin the wheel and land on a different genre or topic, exploring it through 4 or 5 different stories. Just like this one, Philip K. Dick's Dr. Futurity. I'm Zach, and this week I'm really interested in what it means to be considered an author's worst novel. Not saying I agree with this assessment, but, like in the oove, what does it mean to have a stinky egg in the oove?
I'm Bob, and I'm interested in some things that I bet everyone already knows about Philip K. Dick, but I want to talk about it after we go through this novel. But for immortality, I'm really interested in what the difference is between immortality for a society or a way of life and immortality for a person.
Well, before we go into the meat of the story, Bob, what do we know about Philip K. Dick?
So this is, I think, the third one that we've read together. We did Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? We did Deus Irae, I guess fourth. And we did Faith of Our Fathers from Dangerous Visions. So we're looking at 67, 68, 76, and now this 1960, much older. We have read stories where Philip K. Dick is looking at what it means to be human. So for Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, what happens when you have someone going to pursue people that are basically human? And of course, there's other spoilers involved in that story as well. We have, in Faith of Our Fathers, we wondered about different gods and how Philip K. Dick's idea of science fiction, bringing a science fiction story to life, is almost a religious experience for him. That was one thing we were especially interested in.
This one to me feels so different than the previous ones we've read. And a lot of what you said about religious experience doesn't seem to be at play here, though I do think that we might be able to read something into that in an interesting way. But I think like positioning this within his history of writing is really interesting, because maybe we can start to see seeds of things that he became more interested in this book, but then goes on to develop later. Now, one thing that people always say about this book is that it's early Philip K. Dick, which I think is such an interesting thing to say, because at this point, he has written 85 short stories and 6 novels. So, if I wrote 85 short stories and 6 novels and someone said I was in the early stages of my career, I would probably just, I would quit right there. I would be like, oh my God. So obviously the work he goes on to do, starting especially with books like The Man in the High Castle, are generally considered to be of so much higher caliber than this work. I've heard a lot of interesting theories why. One of them from Jonathan Lethem about how basically around this time, Philip K. Dick said, I'm sick of science fiction. I hate it. I don't want to do it anymore. So what he does is he writes a bunch of realist fiction, like literary fiction novels. He tries to rebrand himself as a literary fiction author and get in the more, I don't know, I guess you would say like respectable literary scenes of the United States at the time. Well, it fails. It completely fails. Most of those books aren't even published until after he dies. But it's almost as if he put the hours in. It's the act of writing 6 literary fiction novels that Jonathan Lethem argues gives him the chops to come back to science fiction and apply what he's learned onto his genre fiction.
Jonathan Lethem was also the editor for the exegesis of Philip K. Dick. I think that was the right editor. And I want to look at that later too, because yes, he, like we found, Robert Silverberg, was also getting tired or wanting to stop being pigeonholed and was trying to write these literary fiction novels and get out and get publishing elsewhere. Philip K. Dick, around the same time, so like I think in 77 is when that speech comes out. And he also talks about in France, people loved Philip K. Dick. In the US, he could sell some short stories, but then lots of his novels wouldn't get sold, at least none of his literary fiction novels. And I think he wrote almost like 5 or 6. And at the time, only 1 got accepted to be published in the US. However, in France, they said, we'll publish everything you ever wrote. So science fiction was well respected in the 70s in France and not so respected in the US. So it wasn't just that he didn't like science fiction. He just wasn't getting the acclaim that he deserved, because no science fiction writers really were at that time. I mean, in the circle, yes, but in mainstream success, not so much.
That's really interesting. I wonder why the science fiction authors would be finding more success in Western Europe. And I don't know. Do you have any speculation why? I couldn't even begin to wonder.
Well, he does. He says that he specifically is liked in France because his greatest inspirations are French. So he said one of his favorite novels is Madame Bovary. He loved Flaubert, and he said that he, as a writer, grew up. He grew up in Berkeley, and so he was reading Tolstoy, he was reading Flaubert, he was reading lots of classics. He said he read all of Proust, and he said, okay, those are the writers I'm trying to emulate. I happen to be interested in these big ideas, but the style that I want to do is a slice of life classical style, and that's what he brings into his novels. And he says, that must be why the French like me. He, in addition to doing that speech in 1977, he was at Metz at this science fiction conference. He was also interviewed, and he goes, one of the first questions that they ask him is, what do you think the difference between publishing in France and publishing in the US is? And that's basically what he explains.
That's really interesting. And I wonder if that goes some distance the way of explaining maybe why, we're both constantly drawn to Philip K. Dick. He's an author who, I think we say this every single Philip K. Dick episode, but, at one point you remarked that you go into every Philip K. Dick novel waiting for him to disappoint you in some way, but you're by the end of it, your jaw is always on the floor. You're always like, wow, it's so good. Now, I'm really curious if you felt the same way after this novel.
So I read a very good review of this novel, and I just agreed with it so much because I also I just don't like time travel. I'm not interested in time travel. But another reviewer, Science Fiction Ruminations, they said, I don't like time travel at all, but I thought this was okay. So I also thought this was pretty good. Another person, The Forgotten Fiction, another blogger, said that it's an overlooked gem, and they love this book because I think it is actually quite progressive because it's looking at all sorts of different, like it's anti-colonialist, it's for women's rights, it's lots of great things that he's writing about. It's just also super weird, and everything kind of gets lost a little bit in the weird timey-wimey stuff.
Yeah. I think maybe this is a good point to talk about what actually happens in this novel. But to preface that, we read this story with a lineup of 4 other books having to do with immortality. And the reason why I specifically picked this one is because of this premise of going to a dystopian society where everyone clamors for death because death is the start of new life. People are born out of a soul cube where basically it's like just think of it as an embryo warehouse, basically. But at the rate of whenever someone dies, a new person it comes out of the soul cube, basically. Well, that ended up being like 15% of this book. such a small portion, but I'll give the rundown. You have a doctor gets sent into the future. He goes to save someone's life, but that person is just, no, don't save me. Well, he saves the person's life, and then they decide to end their own life anyways. And he says, what's going on in this strange dystopian landscape? And they say, everyone wants to die, basically. There's no fear of death, avoidance of death in this society. Death is encouraged. So immediately we're thrown into a time travel story, but B, a time travel to a dystopian future story. However, what then happens is he links up with radicals who want to overthrow not just the society, but the entire timeline itself. So they're trying to go back to the 1500s to stop Francis Drake's exploration of the west coast of the United States. And then what you get from there is essentially time hijinks that would only make someone like Christopher Nolan salivate. You know what I mean? Anything I missed in there?
I think that's very purposes. Good. For the Shupos, I want to talk about the Shupos in a minute. But
my God.
The Shupos were crazy. Now let's just talk about them now. I want to talk about the Soul Cube more, but the Shupos are just nuts. And I think a overlooked, very interesting part of this novel, because the Shupos are the youth, but the youth are also like paramilitary assassins who travel in small little hordes who are encouraged to do violence against anyone they think is against the Soul Cube or against the whole society. So they're violent little like creatures just running around and attacking people, and they they don't talk to you much. They just show up and start murdering. I thought the Shupos were a great addition to this book.
It's like a combination between Mini-Me and like Mao Zedong student groups, you know?
Yes. Just the Oompa Loompas gone bad.
Yeah. Yeah. So this was really interesting because I also really, really like the Shupas, but they're really just introduced and then they're kind of left behind. Mm. You know, you know what I mean? Like they're introduced and they're kind of, they're picked up for us to look at and they're put down. And this is actually what I realized is the stylistic characteristic of this novel, which is he picks up ideas and then he puts them down again. Let's talk about this. And then we put it right back down. And what I think that we have here that makes it different than many of the other kind of pulpy golden age science fiction books is a lot of those have one idea that they beat to death and one idea that they explore fully. This is a kind of literary ADHD. And I want to know from you whether you think that helps the book in the context of other books like it being written in this time, or whether it harms the book in the context of other books at this time in the genre in which it's being written.
I think it's being written when he's on amphetamines, if I can remember correctly. I think it's about that time.
That's supposed to fix ADHD. What happened?
I think he went a little too far. Yes, so I won't talk about personal experience, but I can imagine that this is just jumping around and around, being too inspired by different things and trying to get these things done. I know he was, maybe I'm wrong about the timeline, but he was taking amphetamines because he was trying to get enough stories written. Because then, it didn't pay great, but it paid a lot more than it does today. So you could write some stories and make a living, but he was trying to turn them out. And this, as an early novel, is probably like, okay, go full speed ahead like you're writing a short story and just keep going and maybe write it in a couple days. Who knows exactly how long it took him to get this done, but it does feel just full speed ahead, pedal to the metal.
I actually do know that this is an expanded version of a previously published short story called Time Pawn, which I think is an incredible name. A much better name than Dr. Futurity.
We're all time pawns, Zach.
Yeah,
I want to come back to pawns later because feel it every day. Chess is very important for him as a metaphor. In 1977, so I keep referencing this famous speech in 1977. It's really interesting because lots of other science fiction writers were there. Harlan Ellison, for instance, was there. And at the end, let's see if I can find my Harlan quote. He said they were not talking at this time. And then he says, Dick looked like he had been, the audience looked like they had been stunned by a ball-peen hammer. They thought that Philip K. Dick was either drunk or doped. So at the time of the speech, do I have the year wrong? 1977, yeah. So he gives this speech about this programmer and basically says that there is this, it later becomes Valis, the vast artificial. Anyway, what is it? What is
living something? Yeah.
Living intelligence system, I think. I
think our viewers have Google; they can figure it out.
Yeah, sorry, I don't have enough hands to do it well. So he calls it a programmer-reprogrammer in a matrix world, and it's this godlike thing that maintains an advantage against a dark counter player. So it's kind of like Bergman, where you have the knight and death playing chess together. But in this world, you have kind of God and then the anti-God playing chess together. And every move, as far as I can understand it through this speech that people call rambly, but I thought was super interesting, but people say it doesn't make any sense. These two players are playing, and our experience of time happens as these two players play. So as the one black piece is moved, that actually changes everything about the counter move that's going to be happening in white. So as we're moving through time, it is just one constant thrust forward through time. However, the kind of intentions are changing because of every move and counter move. And so he gives this whole thing this whole example. And then he says he has dental surgery and he's coming home. After that, he has this vision. The person who delivers the pain medication at his house has a necklace. He sees the necklace. It's the fish, the Christian fish, and then a pink light shoots out. And so for a long time after that, he sees this pink light and thinks it's an intelligent light that is giving him information. He also realizes, he explains, that we are all in different layers of potentialities. So it's not just that there are different universes or pocket universes. He calls it orthogonal time. So if time is moving forward, there's also slices of time. So any slice could go slightly differently. So he talks about, you mentioned Man in High Castle earlier. He says that actually was not fiction at all. It is something that, because of this thing that was awoken in him, this pink light that gave him these visions, it gave him visions of a different timeline or a different existence, kind of a sub-layer in those layers of time. And he says, okay, Man in High Castle is real, and I'm remembering it. But it's not just remembering, I'm actually channeling being there now, if I'm understanding it correctly. But he starts to think that it's not just creating fiction, but he's actually channeling these other dimensions and giving voice to them in a way that will wake other people up and show them the way back to a kind of paradise. So anyway, in 1977, he gives this speech and everyone says, "Are you trying to start a religion?"
Well, I'm reminded of two different views of creativity that you can hear floating around. One of which is that writing doesn't come from you. You're actually channeling the creative muse, you know? I mean, I think the earliest example of literature in Western history, Homer's Odyssey and Iliad, you know, they start off with an invocation to the muses to, you know, send down the creative juices, send down the right words, send down the story that the poet then channels into the pen. The other thing I'm reminded of are people who are remembering past lives, you know, through like hypnotism or deep meditation. They say, you know, in a flash, I suddenly remember the entirety of a previous lifetime in which I've lived. And it's interesting that Philip K. Dick seems to be doing something on a very similar register, but it's not a like past life in which he's reincarnated out of, or he's reincarnated into this one and this is the previous one. It's like a different alternate timeline. It's a split somewhere, and he's merely like looking over the fence, so to speak, on another world. I don't know. I guess what I'm saying is I feel like I don't personally know any other authors who have this kind of framework around their own creative work. But I think it's not as, I think we can situate it within other explanations from artists on how their creativity functions. I think it slots in quite nicely. It's not as like random and obscure and crazy as it obviously sounds on the get-go.
I think it certainly sounds crazy, and people interpreted it as crazy, but it also sounds pretty cool. Because he's not just saying like, oh, I'm getting all these crazy things that are from all these different dimensions. He's saying that they're almost messages that are necessary, because he says this, quote, "What we need at this point is to locate, to bring forth as evidence, someone who has managed somehow, it doesn't matter how, to retain memories of a different present. Latent alternative world impressions different in some significant way from this, the one which is at this stage actualized." And he even says that through doing this, we can somehow teach each other to get back to a better present. So it's not like a Hegelian moving through time towards some perfect future. It's right now, the present could be perfect if we just all remembered how to move to it. So it's cool.
So it's like a collective amnesia kind of a thing, but it's not like the other presents are perfect. It's that if we had more knowledge about how, like, what potentialities exist within the present, we could move towards something else. So is that kind of what he's saying?
Yes, because we could also move down, because he says it could get even worse. You know, there's all of these different versions of it. And it's interesting that you say amnesia, because he also says this process of remembering, he calls it anamnesia, you know, unremembering. So he is trying to, it gets weird eventually. I mean, this is already kind of weird, but he eventually kind of starts comparing himself to a prophet, saying, like, I am trying to teach you through science fiction and through my writing to help you move towards that perfection. And he actually starts using Christian language and saying it's an almost Edenic place. He calls it a garden, and he says that Christ actually came down 2,000 years ago to tell us how to move through these layers of existence. But the Romans destroyed that information. So you can kind of feel that in Dr. Futurity, even though this is an early novel, but you feel like there's that, not obsession, but there's kind of the twinkling in his eye of this idea of moving through different planes of existence, because yes, it is a time travel story of trying to fix things, but the novel also shows that you can never really change time, because whatever you do, it's going to thrust it, it's going to fix however it wants, but you can try and play the chess game.
It's really interesting to hear this idea that we, on an individual personal level, have an ability to change things with the timeline, according to what he's saying in his, at least his later years. And I say that because oftentimes I get a sense of determinism in Philip K. Dick, or lack of control. And the Science Fiction Encyclopedia actually succinctly wrapped up this kind of theme or feeling that I've sensed in his work, but I haven't been able to pinpoint before. But they say that a major component of so many of his classic works is the idea that there are multiple layers of existence. And we exist, I guess you could say, on a bottom level of existence, which is like a world of, appearances, so the world of everyday life. And we think that that's all there is, but there's actually a higher level, which is more objective, where the entities in control actually are. You know what I mean? The forms that are actually in control are in that higher level. In that short story that we read when we were reading All the Dangerous Vision Stories, Faith of Our Fathers, there's this idea that you had a political operative who would be existing in that world of, forms and, appearances in everyday life. Political operative goes into this party with a high-ranking political member and discovers that the leader of this, government organization is actually this cosmic entity, that shape shifts and people see different things, but it's in the form of a president. So that is the example right there of you have the world of appearances, but something higher, something spiritual is actually in control. And we think we have control down here, but we have nothing because it's all manipulated behind the scenes. So what I wanted to point out was, on the face of it, it looks like that is totally missing from this novel, Dr. Futurity. But on the contrary, I do want to point out that this time travel overlay does seem to retain a lot, maybe not retain, I want to say preempt. It seems like an early example of this kind of two worlds overlaid on top of each other, in the sense that we have history as we know it, and then we have the history behind the history. Francis Drake wasn't a real pirate. He's a guy from the future who came back but couldn't get a time ship back to the future. And many events that, people try to move around in the normal flow of time, well, when we're not looking, there's actually time travelers coming in and moving things around and killing certain people. And, this idea that behind our everyday experience, there's actually a lot going on that we have no access to, but it determines every single thing.
I think what you just pointed out too is really formative for his later ideas. There's the scene with Stenog. Stenog is a guy who's in charge of the Soul Cube and is kind of in charge of society and making sure the right people die, the right people reproduce, et cetera, et cetera. But when he takes Parsons up to his office, there are a couple of portraits, and one is Drake, and one is also Drake. But then as Parsons looking at them, he's thinking, wait a second, why do they look slightly different but also exactly the same? And he's starting to think, okay, maybe that picture is actually Stenog impersonating Drake from the future, going back into the past, having a portrait painted of him, and then bringing that portrait back into the... Anyway, and so he starts to say, okay, then was there ever really a Drake, or was it always Stenog? And in this 1977 address, he also, in addition to the chess metaphor, has a metaphor about paintings. And so in this master's house, these servants put up a painting, change the painting. The master wants new paintings every day. However, they get tired of it, and so they just start painting a little slightly different thing on the painting. So the master says, it's the same and yet not the same as it was yesterday. And apparently that is kind of our experience of remembering things out of sync with time, or kind of outside of time, that wake us up to this programmer, reprogrammer, prime mover existence where we're all inside of this little universe and the prime mover is moving things around. But I was thinking in the future, as we have AI and AI will become agentic, it becomes agents being able to change information kind of at will. I'm wondering, will it collapse time, or at least our understanding of time, in the same way that Stenog being Drake almost collapses time? Because it's like, okay, if the future has influenced the past or even replaced the past, what does the past even mean anymore? But for us, if we have agentic AI that can go back and potentially rewrite Drake and say, no, Stenog was Drake. I mean, that could really happen in real life. AI could change everything for generations. So any of our access to any sort of online encyclopedia could become Stenog was always Drake. Do you think as we get more agentic artificial intelligence, could it happen that our understanding of time does become flattened?
Well, I think you're pointing to something real, but I also think that this is like a process that goes on with or without AI. We're always rewriting history and our understanding of it. And, honestly, that's exactly what they're doing in the book. They say, oh, if Francis Drake hadn't have hung out in California, white Europeans wouldn't have taken over North America, which to me was like the most absurd thing I'd ever heard in my life. Just because Francis Drake is, I don't want to say a minor character, but there's
some other explorer.
There's already a lot of other people. You know what I mean? But it's this idea that I think we always kind of selectively pick and choose data and information from the past and elevate the importance of some and whittle away, diminish the importance of other data points about the past. I think that we're constantly rewriting history in light of the present. And I think that what you're pointing to with AI is definitely like a real concern, but it's not a change of function, it's a change of speed. It's in the sense that, if things are automated, things can happen much, much more quickly.
But what if it happens without us even knowing it? For example, the Berenstain Bears, which have always actually been the Berenstain Bears.
And there was always a cornucopia in Fruit of the Loom in their logo. I know it. I know it.
There has to be. There is. Is there not?
Not in this timeline.
Oh, no. That's
not
disturbing.
In this cursed timeline we're in.
Oh, God. Okay. That's very unsettling, Zach. Sorry.
Yeah. So we're reading this book in context of immortality. And, I'm so glad we read this book, but I don't know how much I can really say it has to offer to that specific conversation. Did you find anything in there that you felt like added to our understanding of the topic?
I thought it was very interesting for immortality. When you have the soul cube and everything is planned, there's a great quote from this book where they say, those to come, so the future generations, are more real than those alive today. And that is one reason why it's so positive to kill people. I mean, when we first meet Parsons, he's transported to the future. He's down on the road and some kid's like, okay, buddy. And just like drives as fast as he can to try and kill him, because that is the what you're supposed to do. When people get old enough, they go onto the road and you just hit them with your car. That was nuts. Yeah. That was just nuts. So I thought that was interesting because they call it extinction of the individual for the sake of the future. So it is very different from our other books where we had this idea of, I want immortality. I, the individual, do not want to die, either because I'm afraid to die, I don't think I deserve to die, or I want to see what the future looks like. Here, the society must be immortal. It must keep going, and the only way we're going to do that is to control everything. It's very Spartan. Everything is planned. If you're not right, you get killed, and then we keep going. I feel like that is a new take, an immortal society.
Let me read a quick quote here. He's having a conversation with Stenog. Death, Stenog said, is part of the cycle of existence, as much so as birth. You saw the soul cube. A man's death is as significant as his life. He spoke disjointedly as traffic ahead of him caused him to turn his attention back to driving. And yet, Parsons thought, This man does everything he can to avoid piling up his car. He's a careful driver, a contradiction. But Parsons then says, in my own society, nobody thought about death. The system in which he had been born, in which he had grown up, had no explanation for death. A man simply lived out his life and tried to pretend he wouldn't die. And that I thought was a really interesting thing, because I think he's right that, by not considering death at all, there is a kind of pretending that we will live forever that happens in kind of everyday life. Kind of like, oh, there's always tomorrow to do something. Oh, there's always next year to go chase that dream, but we, what he describes as neurotically, refuse to recognize our own mortality.
It makes me think it's very anti-Greek. When we read the Iliad, it's always, I don't know when death will come, but I must make sure it's a good death. Death is part of life. It has to be part of, you're not just defined by your life, you're also defined by the way that you die. But you're right, we are very afraid of it, and no matter what, we will avoid it. It's not at all a part of our legacy. It's something that will destroy our legacy because it's going to take it all away. I was thinking that we often talk about art as a way towards immortality. You create something, and then maybe generations and generations will still know it and know your name. Homer has been around, for millennia, but also family is too. And this is a similar way where you have, in this society, the soul cube keeps the whole big family going, but then individuals also have multiple generations of family. And I was just wondering, as a way towards immortality, having some kind of art, do you think is it different here when art is being not art, when life is being dissolved into biology? Because it's no longer my art that's going, it's no longer really my family that's going, it's just my genes with no attachment to my personality or to my consciousness. It's just our collective gene pool going.
Yeah, it's what it really is about the strength of the society. The society becomes immortal by devaluing the individual. And what the argument is that healing everyone would, if they had doctors in the society, which they don't, healing people would cause society to collapse. They're really on this kind of natural selection thing of people who are able to live well beyond their natural lifespan or their ability to survive are actually hampering the whole society's collective ability to carry on. It's interesting how they live. They have a society where all males are sterile, and then they do some kind of games there so that basically they want the best genetics to be combined within this machine that spits out the babies. The argument is that if they didn't do this, then society would collapse. Now, we just read another book that depicts societal collapse in a world where people have basically stopped breeding. Paul Anderson's The Boat of a Million Years, which gives us all of human histories from the eyes of a 4 or 5 or 7 or 8 immortal people who have lived throughout all of human history. But at a certain point, the switch flips and they kind of offer immortality technology to everyone who's currently alive in the world. And then they watch what happens to Earth. And it basically slides into decadence and hedonism and finally nihilism. People have nothing left to live for except for just their own pleasure. And eventually, at one point they're off Earth and they get the message that essentially Earth has collapsed. There's nothing left of it. So it's interesting to see these different competing views of society that actually go hand in hand. I feel like these authors are more or less offering a very complementary view of the role of death and giving our lives meaning in a social context. All right, well, I think that we owe it to ourselves to keep rolling with Philip K. Dick as soon as humanly possible. We'll find a way. We'll find a way. By God, we're going to do it. I'll talk to you later, Bob.
Talk to you later, Robot Zach.